Hi there, I'm Menzies Johnson, drummer of Immortal Omen, a freelancing drummer and BA4 student of Perth UHI. This is a discussion with record producer and engineer Mark Tindal on the drumming of our upcoming single Until I'm Dead. We explore Mark's processes on recording drums and ultimately focus on what techniques he used on our track. This helped me get a better sense of how to record drums by myself, as well as looking into specific miking and mixing techniques to help get the perfect drum sound for my Honest project. With all that being said, here is the interview and thank you for listening. You ready to start, man?
Yeah, man, I'm all good.
Awesome. So, we'll start with this simple question, which is what's your overall process when beginning a day of recording drums when you're in the studio? Do you normally start with tuning the drum, and what kind of hardware and software would you use?
Cool. So yeah, I rent an external studio because I do a lot of stuff in my house and my neighbors would hate me. So I go down and I'll start by tuning the drum normally. I use a drum dial, which I think the company is actually called Drum Dial. So it's just like a little like mechanical thing, and it just senses the tension at each lug. So I'll go in, get the drum kit, tune it to something called tympanic pressure or tympanic tuning,
Okay.
which is basically, as far as I'm aware, each drum, depending on the diameter and the depth of the drum, has like a frequency that it would naturally resonate at due to the design of, like, the dimensions.
Yeah.
So drum dial gives you a little sheet. It says basically whatever your size of drum is, these are the tensions you want it to be at tympanic pressure. So I'll do that for the entire kit. Then I'll go through and check with a little pitch pipe just to see how it sounds. And if there's like toms that are kind of out of tune with the song, I'll just tweak them from there. But that gets me in a ballpark. So it's actually for tuning and setup, no software. I just do it all in the room, stick, drum dial, and that's me.
Nice, man. That's good to know about this because I'm actually trying to learn how to tune as well. Because yeah, I've been drumming for ages, but it's still one of those things that it takes so long to have the knowledge for and try and get the right kind of attitude. And I'm
Yeah.
always just trying to use my ear, being like, okay, what sounds good. But these are little things like these can help a lot.
Man, that is the thing as well. Like with the drum dial and getting it to a place, you then need to tweak with your ear, but just having that assurance that all the lugs are, the same pressure around and you can hear the tone of the drum, you can tweak from there, and change the tuning and stuff. But without, like, I don't find it very, I'm not very confident at tuning drums without starting with the drum dial to make sure that the pressure is cool. Then I can tweak from there.
That's awesome, man.
It's a good way to start.
Cool. So after you've done tuning the drums, which actually kind of leads to question too, what kind of microphones would you use for each part of the drum kit, and do you use more than the average setup?
Cool. So over the years, I've built up my like ideal drum mic locker. So I started with like a Gear for Music case and stuff, and it was not ideal.
Mate, I vibe with
But
that.
now I don't think I use more than the average. I use close mics, overheads, and rooms. So I'll just go through each drum and which microphone I use because they are always the same.
Awesome.
So on kick drum, I use two different microphones. I actually have them here as well. So kick in, I use this little PZM guy, which is like a Shure Beta 91A. That's it. Yeah, it's like a condenser. That gets you a lot of like click, snap, and mid range, which is really cool. And then I'll put that right in the drum, sitting on a pillow, like halfway into the kick drum. And I use an Audix D6, which is like a dynamic kick drum microphone, which has a lot fuller low end. So
Yeah.
those two together, when you sum them, you get like the mid range and the top end of the Shure microphone. Then the Audix gives you the big fat beefy thing. So that's for kick drums.
Yeah.
They're cool. I tend to find that, like, depending on the style, if it's something like metal, like we were doing, I'll probably end up using both kick mics. If I'm doing something a bit more chill, you can kind of get rid of the Shure, but I'll always put it up because I'd rather have it than not.
Nice.
Snare drum, always the same. It's a Shure Beta 57A, which is just an SM57.
Mhm.
but the polar pattern is like, it's called hypercardioid. So it's basically, instead of picking up all of this, it picks up that, which basically it stops you from getting as much hi-hat bleed.
Okay.
So Beta 57A on the top, and just a standard SM57 on the bottom.
Nice.
Toms, I always use Sennheiser E604s. If there is a floor tom that's really big, I try to use another Audix D6 on a floor tom because it's really like, it's just full of low end and I like it. But most of the time, Sennheiser E604s, beautiful microphones, and they all have clips, so it saves so much hassle. For hats, I use an Aston Stealth, I think it's called. I've got it here. Hold on. It's in one of the drawers. Yeah, it's Aston Stealth. It's basically a Shure SM7B, but made by Aston, slightly different. But it's really big and bulky, but it sounds cool on hats. Then overheads, I'll use Octava MK12s, which are these little Russian mics, come in this like box here, little silver guys. These are kind of cool because you can switch out like the heads, so they have different like polar patterns and stuff, which is kind of cool. But they sound good as overheads. They're just small diaphragm condensers. Sound really cool. And then what else have I got? Oh, I use room mics, and they're the most important mics of the entire thing. I use ribbon microphones. The ones I've got at the moment are by a company called Cascade, and the microphones are called Fatheads, and they're just these big gold, big diaphragm things, and you just put them at the back of the room, and it sounds great. But that's all the microphones. I will tend to use that on every session. The only thing I would say is that depending on the song and what's happening on the drums, sometimes I need to use a ride microphone. Just like if there's loads of bells or loads of dings, I'll probably use a ride mic. Okay. I just use another 57. I'd probably get shot for telling people that because you're supposed to use lovely condensers on overheads, but I kind of like a gnarly 57 on a ride. Well, but that's about it, really.
Nice, man. I think the only side question I have with that is, what would you say is the, like, you said it yourself, it's like one of the most important things with having a room mic. Why is that?
So I think all the vibe comes from a room mic, right? There's a producer called Eric Valentine I really like. He said this thing once, and it always stuck in my brain, right? He's like, the standard way to mic a drum kit is putting like for example, a 57 on your snare here at like an inch away, maybe even half an inch sometimes. But no one's ever listened to a drum kit with their ear 1 centimeter away from a snare. Like, that's not how a snare sounds. The way you hear drums is the sound reverberating in the room and like the room reacting with the drums so that you get that natural reverb and like this kind of big sound. So room mics for me, because I love them. They're honest to God, when I send you the stems over for this song, the majority of the sound is the room mics, because that's how you'll be used to hearing a drum kit in a live environment. Yeah. So trying to capture that feeling on a record is like, it's like my main thing I try to do.
Mate, that's really interesting. Like I love that. That's really cool.
I used to not use room mics. And honestly, man, like the no matter how much processing you use and reverb and all this stuff that you try and create, drums just sound like really flat and like just like really short, like doom da doom da. Whereas if you put a room mic up, it starts to like adds all this length to it, where it's like da. That's my favorite sound.
Takes away a lot of the mechanical side of it, you know. Well, at least I think that's what it would be in my head, you know.
No, that's a great way of putting it. Honestly, like without room mics, it's almost like being played on a keyboard. You know what I mean? It's like very almost sampley, even though it's because like if you think about a drum sample, it is like a one shot on a drum.
Yeah.
If you've got a microphone just pointing at that drum and you gate it, which you tend to do, it's just you turn this breathing cool kit into just samples. So putting the room in gives you more of that life back.
Awesome, man. That was really interesting. You kind of covered some of this, so of course I don't mind if you repeat it
Oh,
or
I'll
like
repeat. I'll repeat.
it was just to ask like now that you've talked about mics, what would you say in terms of microphone techniques that you would use in the drum kits? I know some myself. For example, I've watched you enough. I've seen other people do it, but it would be nice to hear what kind of microphone techniques you would use in the drum,
Cool.
which ones are definitely most important, which you've almost actually just covered there the now.
Well, I can give you a couple, so you'll be fine.
Awesome.
So microphone techniques, I go between. So obviously I close mic everything, which really it's not much of a technique. It's just put it right on it. But for things like overheads and rooms, that's where the techniques kind of really come into play.
Yeah.
So I use a space pair configuration on overheads. So, and this is quite important as well. And this is where my brain has to use numbers here, and the numbers are really important to me.
Okay.
So overhead mics, I've got a left overhead that's sitting over the left crash and the hi-hat, and a right overhead over the right crash and possibly the ride and maybe the china as well, right? They will be exactly 4 foot away from the center of the snare. The reason for that is when you're in the mix, I hard pan overheads left and right just to give the drums like that width. And I found that if the capsule of the microphone isn't identically far away from the snare, the snare shifts to one side. Like if the microphone's a little bit closer, it shifts to one side because there is time between the snare getting hit and it getting to the microphone.
Yeah.
And if you don't get that 4 foot, then you can have like your snare be a bit louder on the right ear, or like a little bit of a slap delay kind of thing. It's really difficult to it's difficult to overly pinpoint it, but you can see it when it happens. So space pair for overheads, I love that. I've done XY before, which is when you just put 2 of them in the same position, pointing like this, as opposed to like space pair like this. You put them on one stand and point them like that. That's cool, but I don't find it as wide as the space pair because they're physically apart. So I do that. And then for rooms, I do another spaced pair at the moment, and this is what I did on your drum recording. I did another spaced pair where, again, they are 4 foot apart from each other, but way back in the room. I do 8 or 12 foot away, and it just depends on how deep the room is. So if I can get it to 12, I like that because you get more reverberation, and it takes more time for the sound to get to the rooms. So that distance to me adds more of that life that I was saying.
Yeah.
The reason I do it 12 foot is because it's like a multiple of 4. So if my overheads are 4 foot away from the snare, then my rooms can be 12 foot away, but they couldn't be 10. I don't know why, but they could be 8 if the room's smaller. That's fine. But again, they'll be 8 foot away from the front of the kick drum, or ideally the center of the snare, and they'll be 4 foot apart from each other, just like the overheads, and the center point will be the center of the snare, so that mimics the stereo image you're getting from the overheads, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
But sometimes I use, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but I think it's Bloomline technique, right? Which is basically you grab a stand, and this is for rooms, right? You grab a stand and you put both of your room mics on one stand, but they're upside down. They're like this from each other. So this one here would be facing out diagonally to the left. I think of cameras here. And then the one underneath is diagonally to the right, but they're in the exact same position, but they're facing like slightly out. And that gets you a really cool picture as well. I genuinely like that. And if you don't have a very wide room, then that's a winner because you can put it in the center, pan them out, and you can see like where the sound is tracking. You're going to get all that side of the kit on this top microphone and all that side of the kit on the bottom. Especially with ribbon mics that I use, they're figure 8 pattern, which means they take from the front and from the back. So those things cross over, and that's quite cool. I do quite like that. I think it's Bloomline. I'm pretty sure it's Bloomline. But for your stuff, I use space pairs for overheads and rooms.
Oh, man.
And they needed to be multiples of 4 and always 4 foot away from each other.
Oh, interesting. You know, I think that's pretty cool. Is now just to double check, that was a bloom line technique you were saying. Is that the same one where I think I have seen you do this as well? And you were talking about the ribbon mics where they were actually upside down from each other, like they were in a line.
Yeah.
But then,
so one faces up and the other faces down, and they're slightly diagonal. You know what I'll do actually? I have them here. Give me 1 second.
Oh, okay.
So I realised that me using my hands looked ridiculous when I actually have the microphones here.
Not at all, man.
So yeah. So essentially, fatheads, aptly named. You stick one facing, I don't know if you can see this here. So that's it there. You would face it like that, right?
Yes.
Then you would grab your other one, and you would face it like that.
Yeah.
So you then spin this one upside down, and put them like this. So they're hanging above and below, so that they're exactly the same, but you can see that that one's pointing that way and this one's pointing this way.
Yeah.
That's the bloom line technique. So they're on one stand, hanging, and this one's capturing all of this side, this one's capturing all this side, but because they're figure 8, it goes back as well.
So, yeah, so in a way it's almost capturing every corner of the room.
Essentially, yeah. And that's quite good because the way that you want room mics to, well, one of the things I want room mics to do is actually get the reflection off the walls. So when that sound hits the wall, then hits back, that's getting projected into the back of the microphones. So you almost get the front and the back noise, and then they kind of merge when it does it, and that's kind of, I think that's something that goes into giving you more length within the drum, because it's got all of the time that it's like it's hit the front, it's hit the wall, it's hit the back, and it's 12 foot away.
And you're doing so well to not miss any type of sound there. That's so clever. I love that.
I wish I could take responsibility, but it's just loads of audio forums.
Right, so lovely talk about the mics. I'm actually learning, and I'm loving this. This one, we're actually going to be going into about what happens after you're done recording drums.
Sure.
So, once you finish recording drums, what kind of processes would you start to use if you wanted to mix the sound of the drum kit? So you've got your raw stems, you've got your raw drums. What would you do once you see them in front of you? What's the first thing you'll do, and what would you start to look at? So do you use samples for most of your stuff? Do you use like just the authentic noise and you EQ them and compress them? And we'll talk about it in the style of, for example, Immortal Woman, like that kind of metal sound. So what would you do?
Okay, so this is kind of it's 2 processes, right?
Okay.
When I get home, there's one thing that I do to the drums that takes a couple hours, and then I would call that preparing them to mix, and then I would mix it in a separate thing, right? So the first thing I do is I come home and I'm a sucker for an edit. I love editing. It's great, right? You don't kill the human aspect of it. You recently put out a video that was the edited drums and the stuff lines up, but I like to edit to get things just on the grid to a degree, within limit, because the human element is important. So I'll come home, I'll have all my multi-tracks. First thing I do is check the phase between everything, which is basically, the best way to describe this for me is, so here's a really easy way of describing phase. So audio is like waves, right? You got like the peak and then the trough.
Yes.
If you had 2 of the exact same thing going up and then going down at the same time, as the exact same sound source, when you put them on top of each other, that's going to get twice as loud, because when that peak goes up, it goes up twice as loud, because there's 2 of the peaks.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
If something is out of phase, which means that one of them's going down when the other one's going up,
yeah,
what happens if they were the same source? If you play them together, you will get absolutely 0 noise, because this one's going up as a wave and this one's going down, and it's going, because it's the same sound, just out of phase, as this one goes down, let's say that that's turning it down by 3 dB,
Yeah.
right? The top one is turning it up by 3 dB. So when you turn it up by 3 and then turn it down by 3, you get to 0. Do you know what I mean?
It basically cancels itself out.
It cancels itself out because it's the exact same sound, but when they're at phase, they cancel each other out essentially, right?
Yeah.
So a very common one is snares. So the snare top and the snare bottom, always out of phase.
Mm-hmm.
The reason for that is because you are hitting the top of the snare, like the head, and you've got a microphone right there.
Yeah.
But then the sound needs to go all the way through the drum, and you don't hit the drum actually kind of projects down the way. Like you hit it, which pushes the air down, which then moves the snares at the bottom, right?
Mm-hmm.
So technically, I'm not sure if this is 100% accurate, but I'm pretty sure this is a good way of thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
You're putting downward pressure on the head of the snare.
Okay.
But once the airflow goes through, it's upward pressure against the bottom. If you think about it, it's pushing it down, which means it's going out. I don't know if that's entirely correct, but that's basically something to do with it. So those mics will be out of phase. So I get my drums in the room. I check the phase between the snare bottom. Your phase can be off in your overheads, so you just need to grab like a big snare hit and make sure that all the microphones are in phase with each other, right?
Okay.
Then I'll do an edit, which is basically just time aligning them to a grid to a degree, don't kill the human aspect, blah, blah, blah. It's little things like, it's getting the groove to really sit. And then if there's like a time where a kick drum's been hit with an overhead, like with two cymbals, and the kick's just a little bit early, you can kind of cut that kick out and move it to being on the right on the cymbal hit. Yeah. Just for that one little thing. You have to watch yourself with phase with that as well, but it does work if you just move one or two kicks. Okay. But in the edit, you would move everything together. But you can move kicks a tiny bit. Right. So I get all the edits done, and then I'd go in for samples. So I use a thing called Slate Trigger.
Okay.
I think it's Trigger 2 actually these days. And what that does is just senses the transient of the edited kick drum, for example. Mm-hmm. And it places whatever sample you want underneath that. So if I was using samples for the kit, I would do that. On this Immortal Woman track, I used a kick sample, but let me just check. Sorry, I have two computers running right now.
Sorry.
The kick sample is at 1/4 of the volume of one of the kick drum mics. And there's two kick drum mics. So the sample is literally there, I think, for the low end, just to make the low end super smooth. I barely use that. I do the same with the snare. There is a snare sample. The reason for that I'll get into when we talk about plugins. Mm-hmm. But the main reason for that is your snare is incredibly deep.
Yeah.
Like, it's so deep that it's got like a naturally low thuddy sound, which I think is perfect for this type of music, because like a higher pitched snare can kind of get in the way of the vocal and the guitars a little bit.
Yeah.
But I put in a very chill snare sample that has just a little bit of crack on the top. So it's not really touching the bottom end at all. It's got a tiny bit of crack, so it sounds like the wood of your stick is hitting it a little bit harder. But that's it.
Totally,
they're both 90%. 90% real.
I was totally like thinking that as well. Like when I got that snare, I was so excited because like, I've always wanted a Tama SLP. Yeah. And I seen how deep it was, and I was like, screw it, I'm gonna get it anyway. I think it's gonna be cool. And then I got it all set up, and I thought, Mark's gonna love this.
It's class. Like I love a deep sounding snare. I'm not one of these guys who loves the pinginess. Like I think it sits really difficult in a mix because it's quite pingy. It's like quite sharp in your ears.
Yeah.
So having like this big thuddy snare, I was like, this is perfect. I just put a little bit of top end on, and realistically in the mix, I could have probably just bashed an EQ with like a high shelf on it. But I felt like I didn't like what the high shelf was doing to the rest of the sound of your snare. I liked what it was naturally, so I was like, I'll just put in a woody hit on the top.
I totally get where you're coming from as well, though, because that was one of the things I did notice when I was looking for that snare. Was obviously I like to look at the actual drum itself being played because I want to know the sound of it. Well, I like the sound personally, and I did notice that it didn't have enough crack personally, but like that was only maybe 20% of my attitude towards it. The 80% was I love that snare.
Yeah.
It could do with a little bit more crack though, and I thought to myself, maybe if I get an Evans head, but that would maybe fix, I don't know, 10% of the 20%.
Yeah. No, it actually sounds really cool. I used a thing called a transient designer. That gave it a bit more hit. It just didn't have the high end. It just gave it like a bit more smack. So tiny little sample blend, but like, man, see when I send you the raws, I'll send you the raw without samples, then I'll send you the final without samples, and then I'll send you one more with samples.
Yeah, of course.
You basically won't be able to hear them. They're just there for like making sure the low end hits exactly this. Like for the kick sample anyway, it's just so that the low end's consistent, same every time. Because with a microphone, like sometimes you're gonna hit, like with a kick drum, you're gonna hit the pedal a little bit harder now and again.
Yeah.
That's gonna happen. Or you'll hit it just a little bit soft once, and you'll go, that's a bit annoying. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And you can compress it and stuff, but the tone changes. Tiny little sample nudged in at the bottom, gets rid of it. So it's there for low end consistency, and then in the snare, tiny bit of top end. That's it.
Awesome, man. Oh, that was really interesting to hear.
Yeah. Do you want me to talk about? Did you say mixing and stuff, like what plugins I would use and stuff, or?
Yeah. So that would be my final question. I'm just making sure. Yeah. No, but yeah, that's definitely it. Sorry. So this is my last question, and that was just to talk about once, as you said, what you would do to fix a drum kit. Being like, okay, that's that out of the road. Now it's on to the mixing, I'm guessing.
Yes.
So what kind of techniques for mixing, mixed with plugins, or just your own type of work would you use to actually mix the drums themselves? Do you have like a specific agenda, or does it go by the sound of the drum?
Sure. It's a good question. I like that. Yeah. So once I've done the edit, applied the samples, drums kit, raw sounds cool. I then edit the rest of the song and stuff. Once I bring it into the mix, the first thing I start every mix with is drums.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I stick to that forever because I genuinely believe that the sound of the drums is 90% of the sound of the mix, to be honest. You can kind of get away with the guitar being a bit, as long as the drums are total slamming, because there's so much energy in them. So I always start with drums, then build the song around the drums. So my mix approach, I'm just having a look, there's another screen behind me, so if it looks like I'm staring off into nothing, it's because I'm actually doing that.
Oh, you do you, mate. You do you.
So yeah, I have a little approach that I take with mixing drums, and it does change per project, but let's talk about it in the context of this project.
Okay.
So obviously I mix close mics first. I start with a kick drum. I like to think that I have what's called like what I like to call, but I don't know if I get away with it in front of someone who's actually old school, but it's like an old school way of starting and then a modern way of finishing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I respect
and I'll
that.
explain it. So I start by gain staging, which is basically just getting the volumes of the individual kit pieces where you want them so that they sound good. Loads of people do that on faders and stuff. I use a gain plugin. It just keeps the faders at 0, makes it look nice. But basically get a rough balance of all the drums sounding cool.
Okay.
And then I just want to enhance or subtract. That's essentially what it is. So my vintage start, I give myself 3 plugins, right? And that's it. I give myself an EQ, which I will always use FabFilter's Pro Q3.
Okay.
It's really good. It's just it's unlimited bands. It's digital, but it sounds good. It's just clean. It doesn't add any sound. So I'll do subtractive EQ with that, which is basically taking out the sounds that I don't like. So, for example, in a kick drum, 800 hertz to me sounds like someone throwing a basketball at the ground. It's got that kind of bang thing.
Yeah.
So 800 comes out for me every time. Same with 300 on a kick drum. 300 in metal, especially, it's just muddy. That's just like super low, but like it's audible low. So that'll come out. So subtractive EQ with Pro Q3.
Okay.
Then I'll use any compressor, really. Stock Logic's pretty cool, but I actually really like the SSL channel strip by Brainworks. It's got a compressor in it. It's cool. And that just what that's doing is it's compressing the signal. It's dynamic control, right? So you can use compression for tonal control and like shape it. A little bit of compression can make something hit a little bit harder. But that depends on how you dial the compression. I go dynamic control, so kind of fast attack, kind of fast release, and hit it 2 or 3 dB, and it's just squashing stuff down so that the hits are more consistent. So like we were talking about earlier, if you hit the kick drum a little bit lighter, then that volume's not going to go way down. It's turning that up a little bit, turning the other ones down. So subtractive EQ, then compression, and then sometimes the gate. The gate sometimes goes first, the gate sometimes goes last. I personally haven't seen an issue with any of that. And I haven't found one that I like better. So it just goes when I remember to put it in.
Okay.
But yeah, so EQ to start with, compression just to level the dynamic, and then a little bit of gating if it needs it, right?
Okay.
And I'll do that for the kick, the snare, the rack, like floor, overheads. I tend not to compress them in that situation, but it's always just subtractive EQ. So I'm never adding anything. I'm just taking away the stuff I don't like.
Okay, that makes sense.
And that's my old way.
Yeah.
Then I blend that with like a bit more of a modern way, where so I send each individual kit piece to a bus, and this might get a little bit confusing, but I'll try and be as transparent as I can.
Okay.
There's 2 kick microphones.
Right.
I'll do the subtractive EQ and the compression on one and the other, and then I send both of those to a bus. The output of those is a bus.
Yeah.
I'm not sending it to a bus and duplicating it and creating a different version. The output goes to a bus. So now that is my kick bus, which is both microphones summed together in one place. I then do additional like subtractive EQ on there. So just take out anything that I don't like with the 2 blended.
Okay.
Compress them to glue them together. Then I go weird. Well, not weird, but then I go modern. So I'll hit it with saturation, absolutely. I use clipping a lot, which is like a form of limiting, which takes the top of the transient off, but keeps everything pretty clean. So it basically makes your natural kicks almost sound as consistent as a sample.
Yeah.
There's a plugin called Soothe that dynamically takes out any ringing frequencies that you might have missed. That's quite cool. All like pretty modern stuff. But that happens on the kick bus, right? And then that'll, again with the snare, I'll do the original stuff. Then on the snare bus, I'll do my EQ, I'll hit it with some saturation, I'll hit it with some compression, I'll hit it with some clipping, and then I'll probably EQ again after that just to make sure that nothing else has happened. And then I do the same with the toms. Toms get the original stuff. Then they go to the tom bus, and the tom bus gets distorted a lot, like a lot. No one distorts toms, but I love it. And then same with cymbals. Cymbals will get like that Soothe plugin, so dynamic like frequency notching essentially. That'll all happen. But so far we've got a kick bus, a snare bus, a tom bus, a cymbal bus, and a room bus. Yeah. Right. They've all been processed individually as tracks, then processed again on the buses. The drum bus then each individual drum bus, like kick, snare, toms, cymbals, and rooms, all go to the drum bus where I hit it with further compression with like a Imperial Labs distressor is the one that I use for metal. It's great. It's like compression and distortion. That glues the whole kit together, and then I clip that as well to make it like really hit. So the volume is there, the perceived volume is massive. It's not the most dynamic thing, but in metal, and especially in this song, it doesn't need to be. It just needs to be holding it down and being cool.
Yeah.
That bus, the drum bus, then goes to the instrument bus, where I just duck the snare, but that's a different technique. But basically, I'm ducking the snare drum, or I'm using the snare to trigger a compressor to duck 3 dB
Okay.
on the full mix. So every time the snare hits, the guitars go down by 3 dB, the bass goes down by 3 dB, like every instrument goes down so that the snare comes through with a massive smack.
Yeah, so it's like almost like it's making room for the snare each and every time.
It's just ducking all the other instruments to get that snare to go bang, because snares are cool. The instrument bus goes to the master bus, where I do top-down mixing. So that's got channel strip. It's like a channel strip emulation, so it makes it sound like it's running through a console.
Mm-hmm.
I do a little bit of EQ on that, but I'm just talking boost the low end a little bit and boost the high end a little bit more, so that you get this sheen and this thickness, which makes it sound more like a record. And then on the master bus, there's further compression, but that's for the entire song. Everything on the master bus affects everything within the song. But yeah, so drums, I'm going to take a step back and make that quicker but smoother.
Yeah, of course.
So affect the individual tracks with just standard EQ and compression, maybe some keys. Send each kit piece to their own relevant bus and affect the bus more thoroughly to get things going.
Yeah.
That's where you're starting to hit more saturation and parallels, like parallel compression and stuff like that. That kicks in. Then hit it to a drum bus where it glues everything together. Hit it to the instrument bus where it ducks the rest of the stuff to let the snare come through. Then hit it to your master chain, and it just hits a natural master. And it sounds like a lot, and it's a lot of back and forward, but as long as you do it in that order, it's not that difficult.
Yeah,
So,
you eventually get used to it.
Yeah, clean everything up, then make it more exciting on the individual buses, then glue it together on the final drum bus. And that should be you good to go.
So
then you work on the rest of the instruments, and then when you get to the end on the master, you put all your fancy master channels.
it really, like, I don't know if I'm just picturing it like this, but I'm kind of looking at your process there, like, as if treat the drums as if you were treating a literal track that you have recorded and you want to mix it and you want to send it to master. So, of course, you would clean it up, then you start adding your mixing, then you try and glue it together. You've basically done the same thing but with just the drums, and then obviously try make it mix well with the rest of the instruments.
That's it, man. That's it. Like, it's spot on. It's like, for example, there's things that I do within drum mixing that don't actually affect the drums, but they affect things around the drums.
Yeah.
So, for example, once I've got my drum mix sounding cool, I need to fit everything around that. So on a bass, I'll use the thing called sidechain compression, right? Where it'll just duck the low end of the bass by like 2-3 dB,
Okay.
but every time the kick hits. So that's sidechain to the kick drum. So the kick drum's got all that thud, that low end, that big boom. And I don't want the bass to muddy that up. So I'm not mixing the drums here, I'm mixing the bass, but what I'm doing is I'm using the drums to trigger a compressor to turn the volume of the bass down every single time the kick drum hits. And we're not turning it off, we're just turning it down so there's room for the kick to come through.
Yeah.
And I do the same thing with guitars around the 3 to 5K area of guitars.
So like kind of like mid-low, mid-range kind of idea.
Yeah, like the high mid, so like 3,000 to 6,000 maybe, sometimes 7
Okay.
hertz in there. The frequencies that are in the guitar kind of hit a little bit with the snare. So I'll do that same thing where I'll sidechain a compressor to the snare drum, so that every time the snare hits, it just turns the high end of those guitars down. So again, there's more room for the snare. Because like I think especially within metal, the drums are the sound of the album. And once you get the drum sounding cool and make sure there's room for them, everything else falls into place. It makes it much easier. The drums are actually the hard bit, but also the funnest part.
Well, that was what kind of led me to that last question, was because I remember that one conversation we had, and I asked you directly about like what it's like mixing drums, and then obviously we had Kev want to come along to the drum session, and you made it very clear that we need to be careful as well as when I asked you a certain question. Can't remember off the top of my head, but you told me it was definitely one of the hardest things to mix compared to every instrument that you would normally do.
Yeah.
Obviously, that could vary, but that totally piqued my curiosity because I was like, I love that.
Yeah, I think the best way I could put it, especially in that context, is that let's take a guitar for example, right?
Yeah.
With the guitars on this song, they went through my pedal board into my Twin and into my computer, right? Via a load box. So there was no micing up a cab or anything, but it is a real amp, but it's a fake cab, and it makes it easier for home recording and stuff. But it sounds cool. A distorted guitar is going to sound like a distorted guitar. There's only one, like there's a left and a right guitar. But the phase, like because of the distortion and the way that they're played and stuff, the phase doesn't really affect it nearly as much. Whereas in that room, when we're recording drums, if I nudge a microphone, the sound changes halfway through the session. If we're not finished the song, we have to restart the entire song because that little one centimeter nudge has taken all of the high end out of the snare. Or if the room mic just happens to turn a little bit too much or something, now the image is off and it just sounds weird. You don't really have those problems with other instruments as much. Vocals are quite annoying sometimes because breaths are pretty annoying and mouth clicks and stuff. But drums are like, you're in my case anyway, I think I'm using about, I want to say about 12 to 14 microphones on one source. And they all need to match up, they all need to be hitting the same stuff, the phase needs to be right. All of those different sources need to make one coherent sound. Whereas with a guitar, it's just the amp. Just the sound of the amp, sounds cool. But it's one thing that you need to make sound cool. Drums are like 16 things that need to sound like they're one thing.
Yeah.
And you kind of, when I listen to music, I don't want to feel like I can hear the snare being cool. I want the drum kit to sound like a really big, powerful drum kit. But it needs to be one instrument. I want it to almost sound like a guitar in that sense. It's just one thing, and it sounds strong and powerful and cool. And that's difficult. But so when you get it right, it's a good feeling.
I can imagine, mate. I can imagine. Totally vibe with that because when I created demos and I would use my little Millennium electric kit to record these demos, you really do notice when you listen to mastered and mixed songs, and then you listen to your own demo, and you've managed to do pretty well, in your opinion, me, on mixing and mastering the guitars and the bass. But then you're struggling. You struggle a lot with this little electric kit because it's all stereo and it's not individual, and it totally takes away so much. And that's why it was good to ask you that question, because it's like, I totally get it why it's difficult. I've tried, obviously not professionally, but I have tried, and like drums alone in a mix can make such a difference.
Dude, that's it. Like, see if you've got like a janky bass tone that sounds a bit crap. Doesn't matter. Like you can get away with it. It does matter. You gotta get it pretty good, right? But you could have the best sounding guitar, the best sounding bass, and like all the keyboard parts could be like sounding stellar. But if the drum kit sounds naff behind it, the whole mix sounds shite.
Yeah.
Whereas see if your drum kit is kicking and it sounds so perfect. If your guitar tone's a bit nasty, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter. The power's still going to be there. The energy's still going to be there. Like you get away with a lot more. Drums are like, there's a story, man. That's like where all the passion is.
Woo! Well, you know what? I will say we'll leave the questions at that. Just to end off the interview, thank you for taking the time to do this with me. It was much appreciated. And yeah, just send over that those drum stems when you get the chance.
I'll just do it just now, man. I've got it loaded up and I'm doing now.
Cool. I'll just end the recording.